At my husband's funeral, I felt invisible. My children didn't even glance my way. They weren't grieving, not really. They were whispering to each other, lips curled in half smiles, their voices carrying in a place meant for respect. I caught enough of their words to know they weren't speaking about their father. They were already circling like vultures, picking at what he might have left behind. My name is Francis. I'm 68 years old, and after 42 years of marriage, I stood alone that day. I had cooked his meals, pressed his shirts, stayed up with him during long nights of worry over the business. I'd been the one he leaned on when the weight grew too heavy. And yet, there I was, treated like a bystander in my own life. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because if you've ever been ignored in a room full of people you raised and sacrificed for, you'll understand how my heart felt in that moment. The church smelled faintly of lilies, the kind you see in funeral homes, too strong to be pleasant. My husband's coffin rested at the front, polished wood, catching the light from the stained glass windows. People came in steady waves to pay their respects. Old friends, business partners, a few distant relatives. They nodded politely to me, shook my hand, whispered clichés about a good man and a life well lived. Then they moved on, drifting toward the refreshments in the back. But my children, oh, they were different. My eldest son leaned toward his sister, muttering about property values. The younger two snickered quietly, like schoolchildren, when one of them mentioned the company's shares. Their heads bent together, hands waving discreetly, eyes darting around the room as though scouting what was theirs to claim. Not once did they stand by the casket with me. Not once did they take my hand or offer comfort. Their grief was for show, shallow as a puddle after a summer rain. I stood stiff in my black dress, hands clasped tightly around a small handkerchief. My back ached from standing, but I refused to sit down. Sitting would have made me smaller, easier to overlook. I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Every so often, I caught a neighbour's eye. They looked at me with pity, probably wondering how children could act like that at their father's funeral. I wanted to tell them, this isn't new. This selfishness didn't grow overnight. It had been there for years. Entitlement baked into every word they spoke, every demand they made. And still, I had hoped that death might soften them. Foolish hope. The priest's voice droned on, a blur of scripture and solemn phrases. I barely heard him. My mind wandered back through the years, to times when my children were small, and I'd carried them on my hip, wiped their noses, stayed awake when they had fevers. Back then, I thought family was unbreakable. I thought loyalty was natural. Looking at them now, trading smirks over what they'd inherit, I felt the sting of betrayal more than the weight of my husband's passing. When the final hymn ended, people filed out. My children lingered, not to mourn, but to corner the lawyer who had just stepped inside, carrying a worn leather briefcase. He was a tall, quiet man, with silver hair and a practiced expression that gave nothing away. His arrival shifted the atmosphere instantly. The whispers around me grew louder, bolder. My daughter tugged at her brother's sleeve, her eyes sharp with greed. "This is it," she hissed, just loud enough for me to hear. They didn't care that I was standing right there. To them, I had already been dismissed. The lawyer gestured for us to follow him to a side room off the main hall. Chairs were set up in a neat row, a table at the front. It felt less like a moment of mourning and more like a business meeting. My children rushed ahead, claiming the front seats as if they were lining up to collect prizes. I walked in last, each step heavy, and sat in the corner. I stayed quiet. I didn't want them to see me tremble. They thought they knew what was coming, and from the smug looks on their faces, they were sure they'd already won. But I had a feeling, call it a wife's intuition, that my husband hadn't left this world without making his voice heard one final time. The room was quiet, except for the creak of chairs as everyone settled. The air felt heavier here than in the church, thick with anticipation, not grief. My children sat shoulder to shoulder, but their postures told another story. They leaned forward like gamblers before a dice roll, eyes sharp, lips tight. I took the seat furthest from the lawyer's table. Part of me wanted to disappear into the wall, but another part held steady. I had survived worse storms. My husband's absences during long years of building the company. The late nights when bills piled higher than paychecks. The arguments with creditors at the door. Through it all, I'd kept our home intact, raised our children, and kept my silence. Now, silence had become my shield. The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the room. He laid the papers out carefully, one on top of the other, smoothing the edges with the side of his hand. "Thank you all for coming," he began in a measured tone. "Your father left clear instructions. I will read them in the order provided." That single word, order, made my children exchange looks. My eldest son leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he already knew what was written. My daughter folded her arms, tapping her nails against her sleeve. The younger two whispered to each other, their voices a low hum, barely concealed. The lawyer started reading. His voice carried the weight of formality, each word deliberate. A vacation house on the coast went to my daughter, who sat up straighter, victorious. My eldest son was granted the smaller apartment building downtown, something my husband had once rented, out for extra income. He nodded, as though he'd earned it. The lawyer continued. Jewelry, vehicles, bank accounts. Each time a child's name was called. Each time their smugness grew. I sat unmoving, listening as if I were an outsider. What struck me most wasn't what they were given, but how quickly they showed their true selves. They muttered to each other after every sentence, calculating values, comparing who received more. I could almost see the arithmetic flashing behind their eyes. I noticed something then. My name still hadn't been spoken. Each time the lawyer glanced down at his papers, I braced myself. And each time he said another child's name instead. Whispers turned into chuckles. My second son leaned forward, smirking in my direction. "Looks like father thought you had enough already, mother," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. His sister gave a quiet laugh, pressing her hand to her mouth as if to stifle it. Heat rose to my face, but I refused to flinch. I stared at the edge of the lawyer's table, counting the wood grain lines until my breathing evened out. The lawyer, unfazed by their cruelty, read on. My husband's watch collection, the wine cellar, even the old lake cabin where we'd once taken family trips, all divided among them. Still no mention of me. By now, their confidence had grown to arrogance. My eldest actually leaned back with his arms crossed, as if he were the new patriarch of the family. My daughter pulled out a pen and began jotting notes on the back of the funeral program, already planning sales, no doubt. I sat there, wondering whether my husband had truly left me out, or whether he had chosen a different path. He'd been many things in life. Ambitious, stubborn, often distant. But careless? No. He never did anything by accident. The lawyer paused, flipping to the final page. My children leaned in like hounds, straining at a leash. The silence was so tight I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came the words that cut the room in half. "And lastly," the lawyer said, "to my beloved wife." The mocking laughter started before he could finish. The moment the lawyer spoke the words, "to my beloved wife," the room cracked with laughter. It wasn't kind or nervous laughter. It was cruel, sharp, meant to sting. My daughter leaned back in her chair, smirking. "Oh, here we go. Father probably left her his favorite teapot," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. My eldest son chuckled, adding, "Or maybe the rocking chair. Something sentimental and useless." The younger two grinned, egging each other on, whispering jokes I couldn't quite catch, but felt all the same. Their voices cut through me like knives, but I sat perfectly still. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. They had already stripped me of dignity at the funeral. I wasn't about to hand over what little pride I had left in this room. The lawyer didn't smile. His eyes scanned the paper, steady as stone, waiting for the laughter to die. But it didn't. Not right away. My children's jeers echoed, bouncing around the walls of that small side room until the sound was unbearable. Inside, though, my thoughts churned. I thought of the years I had spent by their father's side, holding the household together when money was tight, keeping faith when the company nearly collapsed in its early days. I remembered sewing patches onto their school uniforms, balancing the books late into the night, all so they could have a future. And here I was, a widow being mocked by her own children on the day of her husband's funeral. My chest tightened. It wasn't just grief. It was humiliation, raw and sharp. The lawyer's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in insistence. "If I may continue," he said, cutting through the noise. The laughter faded, though smirks remained plastered on their faces. They were so sure of themselves, so certain I was about to receive crumbs while they feasted. I turned my eyes to the paper in his hand. My husband's handwriting had once filled those pages before they were typed and notarized. I could almost see him at his desk, pen in hand, a faint smile tugging at his mouth as he wrote the words his children were about to hear. The lawyer read slowly, deliberately, to my wife, who stood beside me not just in wealth, but in struggle. I leave the choice that matters most. The words silenced the room for a moment. My children blinked, confused, until my daughter scoffed. Choice? What choice? He gave her nothing. She laughed again, but it sounded thinner this time, forced. I sat rigid, saying nothing. I wanted to believe there was more, that this wasn't all he had left me, but fear gnawed at the edges of my hope. The lawyer turned to the final clause, his tone steady as stone. "Control of the company," he read, "passes only to the one who stood by my side at the end." That was when the room truly went silent. My children froze, their smirks sliding from their faces as if wiped clean. No one moved, no one spoke. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of those words. I felt my heart stutter. Could it be? Was he truly pointing everything toward that one truth? That I had been there, and they had not? My eldest son broke the silence first, his voice low but trembling with rage. "That can't be right. He wouldn't do that." My daughter shook her head violently. "This must be a mistake. Mother doesn't know the first thing about running a company." The younger two leaned forward, mouths open, ready to protest. But before any of them could unravel the moment, the lawyer looked up from the paper, his eyes moving slowly, deliberately, to meet mine. "Your husband's instructions were clear," he said firmly. "The company passes only to the one who stood by his side at the end." Then he turned his hand, pointing straight at me. My breath caught. The room seemed to tilt. I hadn't expected it. Not fully. A small, fragile part of me had hoped for recognition. But this? This was more than recognition. This was a verdict. A truth spoken louder than their laughter. My children's faces twisted in disbelief, anger simmering beneath their shock. For the first time all day, I wasn't the one humiliated. They were. And I sat there, quiet, holding the weight of his final gift. The silence after the lawyer pointed at me was deafening. I could hear the hum of the overhead light, the faint rustle of paper as he set the will down. My children stared at me as though I'd suddenly grown horns. My eldest son was the first to explode. He slammed his hand on the table so hard the lawyer's glass of water shook. "This is outrageous. She can't run the company. Father would never—" But the lawyer cut him off. His voice stayed calm, factual, like a judge announcing a verdict. Your father's words are clear. This clause was written and signed in the presence of witnesses. Control of the company belongs to the one who stood by his side at the end. That person was your mother. The anger in the room grew thick enough to choke on. My daughter leaned forward, eyes blazing. She manipulated him. Of course she did. She probably whispered in his ear when he was too weak to think straight. I met her eyes, steady. Your father was more stubborn than all of you combined. No one manipulated him. Not me, not anyone. She scoffed, but her words faltered. She knew it was true. The younger two started arguing with each other, of all things. One shouted, "You should have been there. He asked for you, and you never came." The other snapped back, "Don't put this on me. You ignored his calls too." Their bickering filled the room like dogs fighting over scraps. I sat in my chair, still, almost detached. For the first time that day, I didn't feel small. Their cruelty no longer stung. It exposed them. Every word out of their mouths proved my husband right. The lawyer let them rage for a few minutes before raising his voice again. Your father's decision is final. He wanted the company in the hands of someone who demonstrated loyalty, not greed. There will be no contesting this. But of course they tried. My eldest leaned toward the lawyer, his voice low and threatening. "We'll challenge this in court. No judge will hand over a company of this size to a woman who doesn't even know the books." I spoke then, my voice calm but firm. "I may not know every line of the books, but I know what loyalty looks like. And that's something none of you showed him." Their faces reddened. My daughter muttered something about betrayal, about me turning their father against them. But deep down, I could see it. The flicker of shame, quickly smothered by pride. I thought back to those last weeks in the hospital. The sound of the machines beeping steadily, the way his hand felt in mine. Frail, but warm. He had asked about the children more than once, his voice filled with a kind of hope that broke me every time. And every time I had to tell him the truth. They hadn't come. They had excuses, meetings, trips, too busy to say goodbye. And each time I told him, I watched a little more light leave his eyes. Now, sitting in that cramped room, I understood. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about business. It was about his final judgment, his last way of telling the truth. The lawyer folded the papers neatly and slid them back into his briefcase. "That concludes the reading," he said simply. But for my children, it was far from concluded. My eldest shot out of his chair, pacing the room like a caged animal. My daughter's eyes welled with angry tears. Not grief, not loss, but fury at what she thought was stolen from her. The younger two kept pointing fingers, blaming each other for not showing up at the hospital, as if one visit could have changed their father's mind. I stayed seated. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, but inside, a strange calm had settled over me. For once, I didn't feel humiliated. For once, I didn't feel forgotten. My husband had seen me. He had recognized what mattered when everything else fell away. Control of the company wasn't a prize. It was a burden, one I hadn't asked for. But it was also respect. His final way of telling me I hadn't lived unseen. I rose slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. My children fell silent, eyes fixed on me as though I were the enemy. "I don't want to fight with you," I said quietly. "But know this, your father made his choice. And he made it because when he needed you most, you weren't there." I was. I left the room then, my footsteps echoing against the hallway tiles. Behind me, the arguing picked up again, louder this time, more frantic. But their voices no longer cut me. For the first time that day, I walked with my head held high. As I walked out of that room, the memory of his last weeks came rushing back, sharper than the sound of their arguments echoing behind me. I remember the smell first. the faint sting of antiseptic that clung to everything in the hospital. The walls were too white, the lights too bright, and the beeping of machines was the only rhythm that kept time. My husband lay in that narrow bed, a shadow of the man I had married. His broad shoulders, once strong from years of building a business with his bare hands, looked small against the thin sheets. I stayed by him, day and night. I fed him spoonfuls of broth when his hands trembled too much to hold a spoon. I sat in the hard chair by his bedside, my back stiff and aching, refusing to go home even when the nurses urged me to rest. Sometimes I would fold his shirts in my lap just to have something to do with my hands, the way I had done when he was alive and well. And I waited. I waited for our children to come. He asked about them every day. Did David call? Did Sarah say when she's coming? What about the twins? His voice was hopeful, almost like a child waiting at the window for guests that never arrive. I told him the truth, though it broke me. David was busy with meetings. Sarah had a commitment she couldn't cancel. The twins sent word through text messages, promises of maybe tomorrow, that turned into silence the next day. I will never forget the way he turned his head, staring at the ceiling when I told him. The light in his eyes dimmed a little more each time. One night, when the nurses had finally stepped out and the hallway was quiet, he reached for my hand. His grip was weak, but his palm was warm. "You're the only one here," he whispered. His voice cracked on the words. I leaned closer, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I'll always be here." And I meant it. That night, he told me things he hadn't said in years. How he regretted letting the company swallow so much of his time. How he wished he had been stricter with the children, teaching them values instead of indulging them. "I thought I was giving them everything," he said, his voice breaking. "But I gave them nothing that mattered." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him not to blame himself. I just listened, because I knew he needed to say it aloud before it was too late. When he dozed off, I watched him breathe, shallow but steady. I sat in that chair, my hand still holding his, the monitors clicking away, and I thought about our life together, the struggles in the early years, the triumph when the company finally found its footing, the quiet evenings when it was just the two of us on the porch, talking about nothing at all. The children had grown spoiled by success, blind to sacrifice. But he and I, we had built everything from scraps. We had been the ones who pinched pennies, who counted every coin. And when it finally grew into more than we had ever dreamed, the children thought it had simply appeared, like air. One morning, I woke to find him staring at me. His eyes were wet, but he smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. His voice was raspy, each word costing him effort. "Promise me, Francis. Don't let them take everything and tear it apart." I squeezed his hand. "I promise." Those were some of the last words he spoke before his strength left him for good. And in that lawyer's office, when the clause was read aloud, I realized that was what he had meant. That promise wasn't just for me to keep. It was his way of keeping it for me. By giving me control of the company, he had made sure our years of sacrifice wouldn't be trampled under greed. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't wanted power. But he had entrusted me with his final act of protection. That's why, when my children mocked me at the reading, I stayed silent. Because I knew something they didn't. Their father's last judgment wasn't in money or houses or wine cellars. It was in loyalty. And loyalty couldn't be bought, sold, or divided like property. I carried that memory with me like armor as I left the lawyer's office. Their anger couldn't touch it. Their laughter couldn't erase it. Because I had been there. And they hadn't. When I stepped out of the lawyer's office, their voices followed me down the hall. Shouting, accusing, cursing. My children turned on each other like wolves tearing apart a carcass. For once, I wasn't their target. They were too busy clawing at each other, trying to assign blame. I stood in the corridor, my hand resting on the cool wood of the wall, listening. You should have visited him. David's voice was sharp, trembling with rage. If you had shown up, he might have left the company to me. Sarah snapped back, her words dripping with venom. Don't you dare blame me. You were supposed to be the eldest, the responsible one. You abandoned him first. Then came the twins, voices overlapping, louder and louder. One shouted that the other hadn't even bothered to answer father's last phone call. The other yelled that everyone had ignored him. So why should the blame fall on just one person? It was chaos. The same children who had smirked and mocked me minutes earlier now tore into each other, desperate to rewrite the past, desperate to explain away their absence. The lawyer walked past me, his briefcase tucked neatly under his arm, expression unreadable. But as he brushed by, I thought I caught a glimmer of pity in his eyes. He had seen this scene too many times before, I suspected. Families unraveling not over grief, but greed. I stepped back into the room then, slowly, quietly. They didn't notice me at first. Their shouting drowned everything else out. Sarah had risen from her chair, pointing a shaking finger at David. The twins were red-faced, screaming over each other. The room looked less like a family gathering and more like a battlefield. I cleared my throat. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to cut through their noise. 4 sets of eyes turned toward me, faces flushed, mouths still twisted in anger. You want to blame someone? I said evenly. Blame yourselves, not each other, not me. Your father waited for you until the end, and you never came. Their expressions shifted, just for a heartbeat. Shame flickering across their features before pride swallowed it up again. David scowled. You don't understand, Mother. We had responsibilities. We were busy. Busy? My voice rose for the first time that day. Too busy to say goodbye to the man who built your future? Too busy to sit by his bed when he asked for you? The room went quiet. Not because they agreed, but because they had no answer that wouldn't betray them further. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Your father gave me the company not because I wanted it. I never asked for it. He gave it to me because I was there. That was all. Presence mattered more to him than anything you think you deserved. Sarah's lip curled, her anger turning inward now. So what are you going to do? Run it yourself? You'll destroy everything he built. I met her glare with calm. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But at least I won't sell it to the highest bidder just to line my pockets. The twins looked down at their hands. For the first time, they didn't have clever retorts. David muttered under his breath, This isn't over. His words were more desperate than threatening, but I knew better. It was over. Not the company. That was just beginning. But the illusion that we were still a family in any meaningful sense, that had ended long ago. The will had only exposed it in the harshest possible light. I stood taller, my voice steady. I will honor your father's wishes. Whether you help me or fight me, that's your choice. But his last word was final. Their eyes darted between each other, a mixture of resentment and disbelief. They had expected to be kings and queens, and instead, they were beggars. I turned toward the door, my hand on the knob. Before leaving, I looked back once more. You spent the funeral laughing at me, but in the end, it wasn't me you betrayed. It was him. And that's something you'll have to live with. The door clicked shut behind me. Their shouting resumed almost instantly, muffled by the walls. But I didn't listen this time. Their voices no longer had power over me. For the first time in years, I felt strangely free. When I finally left that building, the air outside felt different. Cooler, cleaner. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, and for the first time that day, I let myself breathe deeply. Behind me, my children's voices still echoed faintly through the windows. They were still fighting, still clawing at each other, still blind to what really mattered. But that was no longer my burden to carry. Their greed had consumed them long before this day, and now it was all they had left. I walked slowly to my car, the weight of the lawyer's words still pressing against me. Control of the company. I hadn't wanted it. I never dreamed of running board meetings or balancing ledgers. All I had ever wanted was for my family to remember where we came from, what it took to build the life they enjoyed so casually. But my husband knew me better than anyone. He hadn't left me the company as a prize. He left it as a safeguard, a shield against the very children who would have sold it piece by piece, stripping away the blood, sweat, and years that went into every brick and beam. He trusted me to hold it, not because I was the most skilled, but because I was the most loyal. That realization steadied me. I hadn't lost everything. In fact, I had gained something far greater than money, my husband's final acknowledgement that I had mattered, that the quiet sacrifices, long nights, small meals, endless patience, had not gone unseen. Over the next few weeks, the children tried everything: angry phone calls, letters from lawyers, demands for meetings. They wanted me to give it up, to hand the company over so they could tear it apart. But each time, I remembered his voice in that hospital bed. "Promise me, Francis. Don't let them take everything and tear it apart." And I stood firm. Running the company wasn't easy. I made mistakes. I learned slowly. But I also found people inside those walls who respected me, not because of my last name, but because they had seen me sitting by his side in those final months, holding his hand when no one else did. They knew loyalty when they saw it, and loyalty commands respect. At home, things were quieter. The phone rang less often. Holidays grew emptier. My children kept their distance, too angry or too ashamed to face me. And while a part of me grieved that loss, another part felt peace. For once, I was no longer trying to buy their love with silence or sacrifice. For once, I let them sit with their own choices. I spent evenings on the porch, the same place my husband and I used to sit, sipping tea and listening to the crickets. Sometimes I imagined him beside me, smiling faintly, proud that his final words had brought me a kind of justice he couldn't give in life. The company thrived, not because I was brilliant, but because I honored what he had built. I refused to sell it, refused to gut it, refused to let greed undo everything. It became less about profit and more about principle. And in that, I found a strength I didn't know I had. Looking back now, I realize the funeral wasn't just the end of his life, it was the unveiling of truth. My children revealed themselves that day, laughing at their own mother in her grief. And my husband revealed his judgment, written in ink, unshakable and final. So here I am, telling you this story not to ask for sympathy, but to remind you, in the end, it isn't money that decides who we are. It's where we stand when the people we love need us most. He gave me the company, yes. But what he really gave me was something no lawyer could draft, no child could steal, no court could challenge. His final acknowledgement that I had been there when it mattered. And now, I ask you, wherever you are watching from tonight, would you call that justice? Or would you call it revenge? I'll leave that for you to decide.